Hello and welcome to Miko Microlearning. This is John Miko and this is the 6th video in the Dynamic Array series. This one focusing on two functions that are kind of sisters, CHOOSEROWS and CHOOSECOLS. So in this video we'll go over the syntax of both. We'll show how they can be used to choose specific rows and columns. We'll nest them together. And then we'll also use a previous dynamic array function, the sequence function, as a specifier. As a reminder, here's where we're at in the dynamic array series. We've done all of these so far. Choose rows, choose columns is what we're going to currently working on, and we'll go on to 2 column 2 row next. So first off, let's look at the syntax. So we saw in take, we could take from the top left or the bottom numbers of rows or columns, if you recall. But sometimes I might want to choose specific rows or columns, maybe row 1, 3, and 5, or maybe the second to the last row. So the take function is limited in that it kind of starts at the top, or the bottom, the left, or the right. Choose rows, not so much. So the syntax, basically, you give an array for choose rows, and then the rows that you want to peel off, if you will. And this could be many rows, it could be one row. Choose calls, the same thing. The columns of the array that you're looking at, and the number of columns that you want to return. So let's look at this example. We have our little fruit table over here in A14 to E20. And as we've always done, say we want to pull out rows 1, 3, and 5. So obviously in G14, I want to choose rows. So I'm going to say equal choose rows. And the array is A14 through E20. And I want to choose rows 1, 3, and 5. Okay, rows 1, 3, and 5. And I'm going to use this over and over again, so I'm going to make that range absolute. I hit enter, and you see it peels or extracts out of that array the first, third, and fifth row. Now, these don't have to be in order. So if I wanted to go back to this and change it to rows 5, 3, and 1, I could certainly do that, and it will sort in that order as well, right? So now it returns all those rows 5, 3, and 1. Just like the take function, if I use negative numbers, it takes from the bottom rather than the top. So if I come down here and I'm going to go to G23, and in this case, I'm going to choose the last row and the third to the last row. So basically, if I use -3 or -1 and -3, it will return 7, which is the last row, and the third to the last row. Okay, so we can see how that works. Choose calls, very similar. Choose calls, the only big difference is obviously it's choosing columns and not rows. Over here, if we want to take this whole array and we want to just return the first 2 columns, we can do that. So if I go over here to M14 and I say choose calls, A14 to E20 once again, and this time I want to return, let's say, actually I think it's, what do I want to return here? Oh, I want to return column 2 and the last row, which kind of tells, or the last column which tells me what row we're in. So I'm going to say -1. The second column and the last column, so 2 and -1. And we get apple, orange, pear, tangerine, and we get these 2 columns. Now what's nice is if I want to return, I can use these together. So let's look at the last one. It says in cell M23, use choose rows and choose columns to choose columns 2 and 3, and the last column of the last row. I want to basically take columns 2 and 3, okay, and only for the last row. So it really doesn't matter what order I do it in, but I'm going to say, okay, equal, let's do choose rows first. And I'm going to say, look at that range, A14 and E20, okay, and I only want to choose the last row, so I'm going to say -1. Okay, now it gives me, it returns an array, right? It's a dynamic array function, and it gives me all of the last row. Well, what I really want to choose from that is columns 2 and 3 and the last column. So I'm going to wrap around that choose rows. I'm going to wrap around it choose calls. And this time, I'm going to say I want column 2, column 3, and the last column. What did I do wrong? So I got a parenthesis wrong. Oops, I got an extra one there. And now we have pineapple 480 and 70. Okay, it's very simple but very powerful, especially when we think about it. Dynamic array functions are always returning dynamic arrays, and sometimes those arrays need us to shape them, right? We need to extract certain parts from them. Choose rows and choose columns is how we do that. This video is going to be a little bit longer because I want to show you how we can use sequence with choose rows and choose columns. If you recall back from one of our first videos, I think it was actually our first video, we talked about the sequence function. In the sequence function, if you give it a shape, a number of rows and a number of columns and a start step, it'll return a sequence. Okay, so let's say I don't want to type out 1 through 5, right? I know I can use the sequence function to generate a dynamic array that has 1 through 5. If you remember, I can do equal sequence, and I can say, hey, 1 row, 5 columns, start 1, step 1. Okay, or those last 2 arguments would default to 1, so I don't need them, but this gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that can be an input into the choose rows and choose columns, which rows I want to choose, which columns I want to choose. For example, in cell G14, it says use the choose rows and sequence to choose the first 5 rows. So I'm going to say equal choose rows here, and I'm going to say A14 through E20, okay? And I could say comma 1, comma 2, comma 3, comma 4, comma 5. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to instead use the sequence function. And I'm going to say, hey, this is going to be returned in 1 row, just like I did over to the right, 5 columns. And it's going to go 1 by 1, so I really don't need anything more. I close this, and now it'll choose the first 5 rows. If I wanted to, I don't know, let's say start that at 2, okay? I could change this start to 2, and now it's going to return 5 rows starting at 2, so 2 through 6. If I'd want to do something like down here, if I want to choose rows 2, 4, and 6, like every other row, once again, I can say choose rows. Okay, I'm going to give it my range again, A14 through E20, and I want the sequence function. So let's think about that. I want 1 row, okay? I want 3 columns, 2, 4, and 6. So I'm going to say comma 2, or 3, I'm sorry. I want to start at 2 and go every 2. That's the step. I hit enter. Oops, I got an issue. Sequence E is not right. Sequence is. So 2, 4, and 6 is what it returns. So that's pretty cool. Now the last thing I want to do is we can do this with big arrays as well. Okay, and we can group these things together. So a table is just a giant array. So if you remember, we have this table over here called sales detail. It has many columns, and it looks like it has also, it has 8,000 rows, right? So if I go over here, and let's say I want to extract the row ID and the order ID. Those are the first 2 columns. So I'm going to come here and say, okay, equal choose calls. And I want to take that whole sales detail, and I want to extract column 1 and column 2. And just like that, I have now a dynamic array that returns all 8,862 rows. But let's say I just want to return, I don't know, let's say I want to return every other row, okay? Well, first of all, I have to know the sales detail table can grow. So I want to know how many rows are in it, because I can add rows, I can subtract rows. So I'm going to go up here to B3, and I'm going to count, okay, I'm going to count in the sales detail, I'm going to count the number of things in the row ID column that have numbers in them. And it says 8,862. Okay, I need that. My sampling plan is I'm going to extract every, let's say, every 5 rows. Okay, so I want every 5 rows. So I'm going to come up here to my choose columns, and I'm going to choose rows around it, just like we did. Whoops, choose rows around it. And in my choose rows, okay, I'm going to make this wide so we can see it up here. In my choose rows, I'm going to say I want a sequence here, and I want 1 row. How many columns do I want? Well, I'm going to say here I want B3 divided by how many, like every 5th row. So I don't want 8,862 rows or columns. I want 8,862 divided by 5. My start is going to be B4. My step is going to be B4. In parenthesis, in parenthesis. And now I have a little sampling plan here. So if I go to every 10, every 20, every 50, or every 500, you notice it only extracts every 500, right? So what a beautiful kind of use, and let me make that wide so you can see it. What a kind of a beautiful use of choose rows, choose calls, and sequence, where I can extract from a large array, like a little sample, if I want to do some work with a sampling of data. It's kind of a random sample. It's called a systematic sample, but that's neither here nor there. And you'll see, because I put this count here, if I were to change the shape of this detail table, so I'm just going to go to the middle of it and get rid of, whoops, just delete some of these rows. If I go back, now my use case, the count updates, right? And now if I do every 5 rows, it's going, or every 4 rows, it's going to work. Okay. So this video was a little longer, but we did a lot in it, right? We choose rows, choose columns. We kind of nested those, and we also used the sequence function to select in a systematic way. In our next video, we're going to use 2-row and 2-call, which is another shaping video, which, as the name yes, it puts in a row to 1 row or to 1 column. Okay. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and please remember that the video, the Excel file to follow along, is in the first comment of the YouTube video. Thank you.